Skeptics frequently argue that the Gospels aren't based on eyewitness accounts. They were composed decades after Jesus' death by people not familiar with first century Israel, and they wrote after hearing stories passed down to them, and those stories came from others who heard those stories. It's just one long game of telephone. So how can we know that we have the actual words of Jesus? Well, one piece of evidence that goes against the telephone game theory is the parables of Jesus. The Gospels present Jesus as a formal teacher or rabbi with disciples. New Testament scholar Peter J. Williams notes that the Gospels use the word disciple or disciples 195 times, and they also describe Jesus as a teacher or a rabbi 62 times. If Jesus was a rabbi in the traditional sense, his students would probably memorize his teaching. Now, think about parables for just a moment. They are very simple and easy to remember, and they have a quality that sticks with you even after hearing them only once. A gifted communicator like Jesus must have understood this, and if he taught for 3 years, he'd likely repeat the same parables, so his disciples could easily pass them on to others without much effort. Now, let's dig in and look at the parables again with the help of Peter J. Williams. I'll be drawing from his book, Can We Trust the Gospels?, and you can find a link to the book in the description down below. Now, before we jump in, I should note that there is no consensus on how many parables are in the Gospels, but there are at least 40 in the Synoptics, and John contains few, if any. The parables in the Synoptics occur in material unique to each writer. They're also found in material found in all 3 Gospels, and they're in material shared between Matthew and Luke. Jesus tells more parables than any ancient rabbi that we have record of. Now, the simplest hypothesis is that Jesus told all these parables for 3 reasons. First of all, Jewish sources often attribute parables to rabbis, but there are very few parables in the Old Testament or Dead Sea Scrolls, nor are they in the Deuterocanonical books. Paul didn't use them, neither did the Church Fathers, and almost all the parables in the apocryphal Gospel of Thomas have parallels in the Synoptics. Now, I should note that some scholars see the Shepherd of Hermas as a parable. That is a 2nd century Christian work, but the Shepherd of Hermas is unlike anything we find in the Gospels. The genre is very different. A lot of it is visionary in nature, and the shepherd is much longer. Parables are overwhelmingly Jewish in genre, and they fit within the time after the Old Testament, but before Christianity became less Jewish. Secondly, if Jesus told no parables, we need at least 3 parable inventors. Otherwise, we can't explain those parables unique to each source. But we know parables weren't popular storytelling forms among early Christian writers. They're not found in the New Testament epistles. The Church Fathers didn't use them. So if Jesus said some parables, but others put them into Jesus' mouth, then we have several parable tellers, and they'd have to come from different places and at different times. Then in a flash, parable inventing just suddenly went out of style among Christians. This seems very unlikely, and the simpler hypothesis is that there was one master parable teller. Lastly, Jesus' parables are literary masterpieces. There's the parable of the sower, parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the prodigal son, and I could go on. So let's just think about this for a moment. What if these were inventions? We would need to posit several later creative geniuses making up these parables, and they'd all happen to credit their less creative founder with their great works. This is much more complicated than Jesus being the creative genius behind these parables. Again, we ought to prefer a more simple hypothesis over a more complicated one. Now, it's also worth noting that Jesus' parables fit well within the time in which they were set. Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai told a parable about a king inviting servants to a banquet. There were some wise and others foolish, and the latter made the king angry by not dressing appropriately. Sound familiar? Well, the key elements of this story are found in 2 different parables of Jesus in Matthew 22, 1 through 14, and Matthew 25, 1 through 13. Many of Jesus' parables actually contain traditional Jewish themes, but then Jesus rearranges them to make them his own, often giving a surprising conclusion. We also see this in the story of rich man and Lazarus. That means these themes are a product of Jesus' setting, which is first century Israel. This would be an awkward fit if the gospel writers were Gentiles writing decades later, far away from the situation. These 3 reasons lend credence to the Gospels being based on eyewitness accounts. They're more of a clumsy fit on the telephone game hypothesis. Jesus' parables give us sneaky good evidence that the Gospels are reliable. If they passed on these aspects of his teaching correctly, chances are they passed on other things about his words and deeds reliably as well.